Hi, I'm Larissa from Beekeeping Made Simple, and this video is about how to help your hive grow. How to get your bees to build more honeycomb, to have more baby bees in the hive, and to grow within the amount of resources in the hive as well as in population. And there are lots of reasons to want your hive to grow, but the main one that you should be concerned about is because when your hive is strong and is large in population and has resources within it, problems can come up, whether environmental like a drought or being really hot out or a lack of flowers blooming, or something else could happen in the hive, like your queen dying. Your hive can recover when they have the resources. If your hives are small or struggling, then it will be much harder for the bees to recover from these issues. You're going to see that there are two main categories that a beehive will fall into when it is not growing already on its own. And that is either because it's weak or sick, or lack of resources in its environment. A great way to help your hive grow, and doesn't necessarily mean your bees are in a bad location, but it's just early springtime, there's not a lot of flowers blooming yet, and you just picked up your bees, your package, your nucleus hive, whatever it is to feed them syrup. Now, I didn't used to feed my bees syrup until I learned that it's important to fake a nectar flow. Now, this means you want to do 1 gallon of water to 1 gallon of sugar, dry white sugar, or a smaller quantity or a larger quantity if you like. You want to add a supplement that has essential oils in it to help the bees digest this syrup. Honeybee Healthy is the one that I go with, and then when you're at the Honeybee Healthy website buying that, they also sell an amino boost, which can really help the bees as well, and just make them a little bit healthier when they're eating this fake honey stuff. Now, you want to do it in 1 part sugar to 1 part water by volume. When you do this, you put it in a feeder inside your hive, not at the entrance, not outside the hive, but inside each individual hive. And what this does is it simulates nectar. It's very watery, so you don't want to give them honey, you don't want to give them more sugar. You want to make it watery in the 1-to-1 ratio. It simulates a nectar flow, and it makes the bees think that there is nectar coming in. Nectar is coming in, that means that there's nectar, there's flowers blooming. And when this happens, the bees will start to build more comb, and the queen will lay more. When you feed them the syrup, it's important to also give them some pollen. Either you can buy dried pollen from beekeeping supply sites and add it into the syrup according to directions on the bag, or you can buy pollen patties and put them in the hive. It's important to give them pollen because since they're going to be having more brood within the hive, those baby bees are fed pollen when they are in the larva stage. And if there's lots of nectar coming in without that pollen coming in as well, it can really stress out the hive because they don't have enough food to feed these larvae now. If you live in warm climates like I do here in Hawaii, you really want to keep an eye on the pollen, and I highly recommend putting the dried pollen into your syrup as opposed to putting a pollen patty in the hive. Or if you live anywhere where small hive beetles are prevalent, because the small hive beetles and wax moth can really take to those pollen patties and slime it up fast. The bees just do not guard those patties for whatever reason, and they can get gross fast. So this is a really great trick for any beekeeper when you're first getting your hives to help them grow. You just want to take it out when either the bees don't take to the syrup and it's just sitting in the hive, or once you have already 1 box or 10 full bars or frames in whatever style hive you have. Once you already have 10 of those drawn out, you can take the feed off. It's really up to each beekeeper. It's a very common question, when do I stop feeding? And really there is no like one specific point that you have to stop. Some beekeepers don't feed at all. Some beekeepers feed for a very long period of time. At the very least, you want to feed when there is 4 frames of brood or less. And you definitely want to have that feed off when you are adding on that 3rd box onto your beehive. Or if you have another style beehive, once the bees are bringing in a surplus of nectar and turning it into capped honey, you don't want to harvest that syrup that's in your hive because it looks like nectar in the frames. It can taint your honey and make it taste disgusting. Number two, now the number one way you can get your bees to build fast and be healthy and calm and to be a happy beekeeper where there is a lot less stress is to put your bees in a great location. This is the hardest thing for me as a beekeeper. Not dealing with varroa mites, which is hard here in Hawaii because there is no frost, and so they will destroy bees, and the varroa mite population is insanely high here. I can manage the varroa, I can deal with other issues, but finding a good location is hard. There's a lot of commercial apiaries here, and although there are flowers, there's a lot of flowers that do not produce nectar here in Hawaii. So finding a good location is huge. I've had bees in yards a mile apart from each other on the same street, and the one yard did wonderful and the other yard was the worst yard I had ever had. It can really vary, and you might think a spot is really great, and then it turns out it's not. It's really just trial and error. You don't know if there's a lot of other bees in the area or if there's just not enough flowers for the bees. And you're going to have to just try it out and see what happens. But moving your bees and having your bees in a great spot is what's going to make a huge difference for your bees. It's not you as the beekeeper. It doesn't matter how much you read. It is where they are and their location that's going to make a huge difference for them. While we're on the topic of resources, make sure you don't have traps on your hive to collect things such as propolis or pollen if you want your hive to grow. Because there's only so many hours in a day and so many bees in your hive. And if they're busy bringing in pollen day after day because you've put a trap on and keep taking it off, then they're not going to be bringing in things like nectar. And here's one of the tricks that is not about resources or strength of the hive, but just a way to encourage the bees to build comb a little bit faster, and that's called checkerboarding. Here we have our beehive, and when you get your nuke, you are probably putting your frames in the center and putting your empty frames on either side. So we have a couple empty frames here. You have your 4 or 5 frames of brood and honey with bees on it, and then you put a couple frames that are empty over here. Maybe you had foundation on your frames. And that is fine when you first get your bees. And if you had a package, then all your frames are empty and you're going to shake your bees in and close up the hive and wait for them to build comb. And when they start to build comb, they're probably going to start to build comb in the center. Now you're going to leave that as is for a few weeks. But then what you want to do is you're going to take the empty frame that's, say, on this outer edge, another empty frame that's on this outer edge, and you're going to go into that center and say you have a frame of bees right here. You're going to say honey frame, frame of bees, empty frame. Frame of bees, brood, empty frame. Frame of bees, honey, empty. And so that's what we call checkerboarding, because you have a frame of brood, an empty frame, frame of brood, empty frame. And so you don't want to put 2 empty frames next to each other, but you want to put an empty frame in between frames of brood. When you break up the brood with this one frame, the bees sometimes will go to that frame a little bit faster and start to build out the comb to fill in that hole, that gap within the brood nest. And so not only can you checkerboard within that each individual brood box, but once you are looking to add a new box on top of your hive, you can do some kind of checkerboarding that way too. So, and I almost never add a totally empty box onto my beehive. If I am adding a new brood box onto a hive, I will take some frames of honey or some frames of brood from the lower part of the hive and put them in the second box, and put some empty frames from this new box I am putting on the hive and put them into the box that is already on the hive. There's just one rule you have to keep in mind when doing this. You do not want to put just one frame of brood by itself in a box. Or even if you have multiple frames of brood, you want to make sure it's a brood sandwich. What I mean by that is if you are putting a frame of brood into a box. You want to make sure that on either side of the brood is a frame of drawn out comb. Ideally there would be some honey or pollen in there with it on either side of your brood, so that it's a frame of comb, and then frames of brood, and then another frame of comb. And then you have your empty frames on either side of your brood sandwich. And that's because the brood needs to be kept at a certain temperature, and especially if it's still cooler out in the evenings, you don't want to give the bees too much work taking care of this brood. And you don't want to put just one frame of brood up there and potentially have the bees not even take care of them because they didn't even realize there was brood up there. And so that's a way that you can encourage the bees to then move up to the second box. You can also just put a frame of drawn out comb. It could be empty, but just have some honeycomb, even a tiny little piece, up in this box, and take one of the empty frames and put it in the box below. You could take a frame of pollen or honey and put that in that empty box. It's just great to have something inside the box when you put it on, as opposed to a totally empty box. And if you are using foundation, it's great to make sure you are getting a wax coated foundation, or you can make a crayon out of beeswax and rub your foundation, or you can do what I do and not use any foundation. And this is literally what I put into my beehives. Now, when you're adding your honey supers on top, your brood boxes might be deeps, so you can't take frames from that and put it in your honey supers. But if you have frames of honey or drawn out comb or pollen or anything that are the size of your super, put it in that super. So maybe your first year you don't, but the second year you might. It's always great to hold on to a couple of frames and put them in your refrigerator or freezer and be able to put them in your hive come spring. If you live in somewhere cold enough, you might even be able to store them in a carport or a garage or shed and keep them safe. And once you have that first super on and you want to add the next super, take some frames out of the super that's already on your hive that has comb drawn out and put them into the next super that you're adding on. People say, should I put an empty super on top, or should I put an empty super over my brood box and put the full super under the lid? The way I run my hives, it doesn't matter, because no super is totally empty and no super is ever totally full. When I add an empty super onto my hive, I take frames from the super that's already on the hive and I put them in the empty one. So both supers are half full and half empty. And if you want to harvest as much honey as possible, don't do the crush and strain method. Don't harvest comb honey. Use an extractor. Bees have to eat nectar in order to secrete beeswax. They have to actually eat a lot of nectar in order to secrete beeswax. So when you spin your frames using an extractor, you'll still have a comb. Store it and put it back in the hive come next year, and they will fill it up a lot faster. This is a queen excluder. The holes in it are small enough that worker bees can fit through, but usually prevents the queen from getting through. Often people use them over their brood boxes to prevent the queen from laying eggs in their honey boxes. I don't use queen excluders unless I really have a good reason to. Most of my beehives do not have queen excluders. I have never done a serious test to see if queen excluders will deter bees from bringing in honey or moving up above it to the next box. They of course do, but if it slows them down or not, I don't know anyone who seriously researched it and done a very good study where they've tested many hives. That being said, I don't use them, and I have found that the bees are a little slow to move past the queen excluder, especially if there is not a huge honey flow going on. And again, if your bees are in a great spot and there's lots of food for them, they will do what they have to do to bring in honey and find somewhere to put it. But these are all things to do when there isn't a ton of resources for the bees and you want to encourage them to work a little bit harder than they currently are. On a side note, there is an interesting thing that bees do when they're in the hive and a nectar flow starts. So if there's not much food to gather, then there won't be as many foragers leaving the hive. They will be inside the hive. However, then when a nectar flow starts, what you'll see is worker bees standing on top of another worker bee and shaking her. Like literally she's just on top of her with her legs and she like shakes the bee. I've seen this a lot. Never in my personal beehives, but when I worked at Big Island Bees and they had their tours down in South Kona, I saw it all the time. So that is what I've read, is that an older worker bee will never, a worker bee will never shake another worker bee that's older than her. However, she will go on top of worker bees and shake them if she sees that there's now food to be gathering and there are bees within the hive that aren't working or doing something. It's essentially a way for them to say like, hey, there's stuff to be done now. Go out and go start doing it. An interesting thing, because you'd think by all the waggle dances that would let the bees know that there's food to be gathered, but it is something that I've seen quite a few times. I wish I had gotten a video of it. I never took a video of it. Another way to get your colony to grow faster is to start with a nucleus hive, or to buy a beehive that is already like a full box, as opposed to starting with a package. You might not have the option, but if given the option, it's always great to start with bees that have frames of drawn out comb and a queen that is already laying. Another great way to get your bees to grow is in that early preparation stage, which is by getting good genetics, splitting your hives, and instead of letting the bees make their own queen, buying queens from a variety of places, not just buying whatever queen is closest, or you call that California company and having it shipped to you, but going to a lot of local places in your area and splitting hives and putting queens from different areas, so that you have a diverse genetics in your apiary and can start breeding bees from the queens that do the best. If you want to bring in more honey, another great way to do it is to move your bees for the honey harvest. Know what big blooms, big honeys there are in your area, and you can find farmland that has it. It might not necessarily be a farm for that. Like here, the Brazilian pepper tree is the biggest source of food for bees. It's not something that is farmed, but it's something that is highly invasive and grows wild here on the islands. And you can find areas where people do not manage the property and has been overrun with Christmas berry, and put your bees there during the Christmas berry season. And then you can pick the bees up and you can move them somewhere else, say for the macadamia nuts or the clover or whatever you might have in your area that you want to harvest. Now, another reason why bees don't grow so much or so fast is because they are not healthy. This could be a varroa mite infestation, tracheomites, nosema, or just a lot of viruses. So if your hive is not growing, if you haven't been doing mite tests, it's great to do a mite test to see if that is an issue. If you are proactive with getting rid of mites, that's what I do, because once your hive is overrun by mites, even if you put a treatment in to lower your mite levels, it still might be too late, because varroa mites do not just weaken the bees, the adult bees in the hive, and the young that they're feeding off of, but they bring viruses. And so even after you treat and you get rid of the varroa mites, there's still going to be a lot of viruses within the hive that the bees might not be able to recover from. Nosema is spores in the digestive tract, so it's really good to make sure that when you are feeding, to give them that supplement to help them digest that syrup better, and to take the syrup off when it's not needed, so that they are eating the healthy nectar that they are supposed to be eating, not that syrup feed. If you have a hive that is weak, often for tracheomites and nosema, the hive will seem just fine and be doing well and growing in the springtime, and then come summer, they just kind of stop. And you don't know what happened. They're not doing well anymore. You can take a sampling of bees to have tested. You can look at them under a microscope yourself if you have one, or your bee association might have one. Or if you're seeing signs of tracheomites like K-wing, or if you're seeing signs of a lot of bee feces inside or outside the hive, you can just put a treatment in and see if that helps the bees. When you have a hive that is potentially infected, even if you choose to do nothing about it, just keep in mind that it can be spread to other hives, especially depending on the time of year. And another one of those tricks that is not really necessarily means you have poor resources or weak hives, but a great way to get hives that are big and booming is to have more hives. Uh, it's partially just a numbers game. Not every hive is strong and going to do well. So if you just have one hive or two hives, I mean, one hive will probably be meh or be doing poor and the other hive will be okay. But if you want one of those stellar, really great hives, having a yard of 10 hives, you're going to have a much greater chance of one or two of those hives being really great all-star hives that the majority of your honey comes from. And this isn't just about harvesting a lot of honey, but this is about having the resources so that you can pull brood and bees and comb and put it in other hives when they need the help. I actually, if I can't have at least 5 hives in a yard, it makes me very nervous. It's really hard, even as an experienced beekeeper, to keep just like 2 or 3 hives. It's hard, and it gets easier and easier the more bees you have, until it gets to the point that you have like over 20 hives, then it gets harder again. If you're finding that your bees are just still not growing much and they are healthy, you've put treatments in, you've fed them sugar syrup, there is a good chance that it is just the genetics of the hive, and it is entirely up to you to decide how you want to proceed. Some beekeepers will just wait it out and see if they survive the winter come next year. Other beekeepers will choose to pinch the queen, which means that you kill her, and introduce a new queen. And finally, another way to encourage your hive to grow is to not use certain treatments come the springtime, because springtime is that very important time. I say spring, but you know, whenever you first get the beehive or the beehive was small and it's now growing, that's what I used to say, springtime. It's very important that the hive grow, that the queen lay eggs, and that the bees build lots of comb, and that the population increase. That's their goal, is to increase the population. And so treatments such as formic acid really mess with the scent in the hive and can mask the queen's pheromones. It is common for beekeepers to lose a queen if she is not super strong and you don't follow the directions to a T. Even if you do follow the directions perfectly, it is possible to still lose a queen. Even if you don't lose your queen while using formic acid treatment in your hive, it will slow down the process of the hive growing. So it is not a treatment I recommend using in the springtime before your honey flow starts. You can use it in the late summer, especially if your queen is very strong and, you know, like a very new queen that you just got that year. But I don't recommend using it in the springtime because it can really mess with the growth of the colony at such a fragile stage of the colony's growth. So those are the ways in which you can help encourage your bees to grow, to build comb, to move up into the other sections of the beehive, to increase brood production, and to be larger so that you can make mistakes, the bees can make mistakes, things can happen, and they will recover from it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, leave comments if you have questions, and subscribe to my channel.